Hello, everybody. On behalf of Albany Law School, welcome to each and every one of you in the audience. In this strange new world, we're finding a silver lining to the pandemic as the ability to attract more folks to attend our events. So thank you for being here today. I am honored to be able to tell you more about this wonderful event and the legacy of Professor Katheryn D. Katz. I'm Melissa Brieger, I forgot to mention that. I'm also delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker today, Professor and Dean Kimberly Mutcherson. Now, Professor Katz was only the second female law professor at Albany Law School. Among many of her crowning achievements was the development of the very first domestic violence seminar in the United States in 1986. She was beloved for so many reasons: for her dedication to helping others, especially her law students, respected for her important scholarship, admired for her innovative teaching. She also served as a mentor for so many other law professors, myself included. She has been sorely missed by all of us. In addition to being a scholar, a teacher, a mentor, and a leader in her field, Professor Katz was also a proud mother and grandmother. Betsy, her daughter, who should be in the audience with us today, Betsy Katz-Toohey, if you're there, and Michael, her son, and his children, all adored their mom and their grandma beyond words. And it's for this reason that they started a lecture series at Albany Law School. And we are so grateful for their generosity and inspiration that have made tonight possible. This is our 6th lecture of the annual series, which commenced in 2014. I feel so fortunate to be involved with this lecture series. What an amazing way to be able annually to bring into the forefront the crucial issues facing our society now. If Kathy were with us today, and I truly feel she is with us in spirit, she would be troubled by the threat on women's reproductive rights. She would be concerned about the pandemic, particularly upon its impact upon women. And I think she would have loved to have delved into exactly what Dean Mutcherson will be presenting today. In fact, I think they would have been fast friends. When I first inquired of Betsy, what do you hope to achieve by instituting this lecture series? She said without hesitation, I just want my mother's name to live forever. And it has. And I can only hope that while Professor Katz is watching us from above, she feels the love for her that is still so much a part of so many of us here today and so much a part of the law school. She's certainly smiling now to see Co-Dean and Professor Mutcherson of Rutgers Law School as our keynote speaker. They share an interest and a fascination in many areas of law. Dean Mutcherson's scholarly work is at the intersection of family law, health law, and bioethics. She writes on issues related to reproductive justice with a focus on assisted reproduction, abortion, and maternal fetal decision-making. As if those issues were not timely enough in today's times, her talk today is of the utmost timeliness, entitled Pursuing Reproductive Justice During a Global Pandemic. Her recent published work includes Reproductive Rights Without Resources or Recourse in the Hastings Center Report, and Things That Money Can Buy, Reproductive Justice and the International Market for Gestational Surrogacy in the North Carolina Journal of International Law. Dean Mutcherson grew up in Silver Spring, Maryland. She attended college in Philadelphia, and she lived in New York City for 8 years. She now lives in South Jersey, just about 10 minutes outside of Pennsylvania. Thus, she's a self-proclaimed Northeast gal through and through, looking forward to renewing my love of Amtrak when the world gets back to some semblance of normal. Aren't we all? Dean Mutcherson received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania, where she majored in United States history and minored in English. She earned her JD from Columbia Law School and was a co-founder of Women of Color Coalition, co-coordinator of Women of Color and the Law Conference, serving as a teaching assistant and participating in the Dean Search Committee. After law school, she worked as a staff attorney at the HIV Law Project. There, she coordinated an advocacy training program for women with HIV, and she served as co-counsel for a case that challenged New York state law that was mandating HIV testing of all newborns. In 2000, she joined NYU School of Law as an acting assistant professor, which launched her distinguished teaching career. She has taught at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Drexel University School of Law, Drexel University College of Medicine. She was also a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Center for Bioethics and the Columbia Law School Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. Since joining Rutgers Law School in 2002, she has held numerous roles, starting with assistant professor and rising the ranks to co-dean in 2019. I am very excited to hear her remarks this evening. Directly after we hear from our keynote, we will hear from our own dean, Allyship, who will ask some questions of the keynote. And if there are audience questions, you can place them in the chat and I'll monitor the chat session while the keynote is speaking. Now, if we were in person, we would have a lovely wine and cheese reception for you all, and I hope you all have a beverage or treat of your choice. We also would be gifting our keynote with lots of trinkets of thanks and swag. So instead, in this Zoom world, we mailed it to her ahead of time, and she will be drinking from the Albany Law glass as she Zooms. There she is. Thank you so much for being here, Professor. I am now delighted to turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I always say that one of the greatest joys in life is listening to somebody introduce you for a talk and thinking, oh, that person's fabulous. So thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to see Allyship, who I've known for a very long time. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here virtually with all of you today. And in particular, I'm very honored to be able to give this talk that is named after someone who obviously has left such a profound legacy on legal education. So it's a particular honor to be here. One thing that I will say, well, two things. One is you may hear the ice cream truck outside. That's because I'm doing this from my bedroom. And I'm surprised my kids haven't come to ask me for money yet. The second thing I'll say is that I am not a huge fan of the virtual format, in large part because I am one of those people who absolutely feeds off the energy of having people in the space with me. So I hope that you will all try to send good vibes through the internet as I'm giving this talk. So as you heard in the introduction, I'm a law professor who focuses on family law, bioethics, health, and reproductive justice. I'm especially interested in reproductive technology and abortion, but I'm broadly interested in the law as it relates to reproduction. So actually, sorry, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, awesome. So here's what I'm going to try to do in the time that I have with you today. One, I want to frame the concept of reproductive justice to make sure we're all on the same page about that. I then want to talk about how the pandemic has impacted reproductive justice in this country, and then think a little bit about what comes next, although I will profess right now that I have no answers, but lots and lots of questions. As I'm talking today, at various moments, I will talk about pregnant women. I'll also sometimes use pregnant people, just to be clear that not everyone who gets pregnant is somebody who is a cis woman. So I want to make sure, again, as I said, that we start off at the beginning, all on the same page so that we can sort of end up at the same place. So the foundation of this talk and of my work is reproductive justice, or RJ, which is a term that was coined by Black women in 1994 who were interested in articulating principles for a movement that went beyond rights and choice and focused on the issues that were especially salient to marginalized women and that centered those women's experiences. So that gave us reproductive justice. And reproductive justice encompasses a woman's human right to decide if and when she'll have a baby and the conditions under which she'll give birth, to decide if she will not have a baby and her options for preventing or ending pregnancy, and then finally to parent the children she already has with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or the government. And this was laid out by Loretta Ross of Trust Black Women, who's been doing this work for a very long time. So a few things that are important to know about RJ. One, it is human rights based. And those of you who are lawyers know that our constitutional order is not particularly interested in human rights. It is intersectional in the truest sense of that word. And I say that because intersectionality gets tossed around a lot now in a host of different academic fields and in the mainstream media, but I'm concerned here with intersectionality in the way it was meant when it was coined by Kim Crenshaw. And there it was building on the work of Black feminist thinkers and activists who came before her. And Crenshaw really rooted intersectionality in the experiences of Black women, for whom sitting at the intersection of Blackness and femaleness meant that their experiences of discrimination and oppression were not simply about being Black or female, but came from the specific experience of being a Black female in spaces where that unique identity was meaningful and sometimes quite profound. It's also rooted in the experiences of women of color, as I said. And so a really critical component of reproductive justice is that it does not center the experiences of white women, but places the experiences of those who often sit at the furthest margins in the center. And the reason why this positioning makes sense is because when we act to protect white women, lots of women often get left out of that protection. But when we act to protect women of color and other marginalized women, white women tend to benefit from that work. And so if we want to have a really tough conversation at the time when we get to the Q&A, we can also talk a little bit about the painful limits of white woman allyship, if you'd like to do that. And then reproductive justice recognizes that reproductive oppression is experienced differently across communities of color and other marginalized communities. And so this really goes part and parcel with what I've already said. So I'm not going to offer much explanation, but the bottom line is that we can't let the experience of privileged folks stand in for the whole, because that doesn't move the needle towards justice or toward freedom. So it should be obvious, based on what I've said already, that reproductive justice is much broader than the sort of traditional reproductive rights that we talk about. So it encompasses environmental justice. So when you have a majority Black city that doesn't have clean water, that's an RJ issue. Similarly, criminal justice reform is an RJ issue. RJ can't exist if Black and brown communities continue to be over-policed, over-criminalized, and disproportionately subject to the death penalty and other extreme forms of criminal punishment. Universal childcare, high-quality public education, universal health care, income inequality, domestic violence, voter suppression, all of these things are RJ issues. So when I think and write about the law and ethics in the context of reproduction, I am coming from the perspective of considering the ways in which the law has acted as a barrier and a burden to reproduction and parenting to a wealth of women, in particular based on socioeconomic factors such as race, income, education level, disability, histories of incarceration, immigration status, and the like. But I'm also thinking about the spectrum of ways in which the treatment of Black and brown people across a range of issues impacts our ability to become parents or to parent our children safely. So our country and our world have been exceedingly comfortable over the centuries in deciding what people and what bodies should procreate, and beyond that, what should happen to the children that those bodies produce. And all of this happens against the backdrop of the deeply personal nature of choices about whether to become pregnant, whether to continue a pregnancy, wanted or unwanted, and how to parent one's children, decisions that are central to identity for many of us. But, and this is an absolutely critical point when it comes to reproductive justice, choice in this context is always, or at least often, exercised within significant constraints. So having an abortion because your state doesn't provide an adequate social safety net is a choice, but not a particularly fair one for someone to have to make. Carrying a pregnancy to term because the Hyde Amendment means that Medicaid won't fund an abortion for you is not a particularly great choice. Risking prison to send your child to a public school outside your official school district is a choice, but one that many parents would make if it meant providing an expanded range of educational options for their children. living in substandard housing because it's the only place you could find where the landlord would accept a Section 8 voucher is a choice. Bringing your child to work with you or leaving that child alone in a car for hours while you work is a choice, but one often spurred by the obscenely high cost of childcare in this country. So we should always be critical and suspicious, frankly, when we're told that personal responsibility requires that people be held responsible for their own choices. But we know that choice is often used as a way to disclaim responsibility for easing another person's suffering. So I want to say just a couple of things about the law and reproductive justice. So there are basically three relevant constitutional rights that are involved when we think about reproductive justice, or three sort of major rights. And again, we're thinking about the right to procreate, the right not to procreate, and the right to parent our children. So this is for all you folks out there who had a con law professor who basically taught Marbury versus Madison for the whole semester. So the first case I want to talk about is Skinner versus Oklahoma, which is the case where the Supreme Court essentially decided that we have a fundamental right to marriage and procreation. Second set of cases that are extremely important here, Griswold versus Connecticut and Eisenstadt versus Baird, which were two cases that first said that married people had a constitutional right to access birth control, and then that single people had such a right as well. And then, of course, Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. You must have been living under a rock if you haven't been hearing Roe versus Wade all over the news in the last couple of weeks, as we've been going through another confirmation hearing for a new Supreme Court justice. And so Roe versus Wade, of course, is a case that stands for the proposition that women have a fundamental right to terminate a pregnancy. And Planned Parenthood versus Casey is sort of the first case to really start to narrow what that right looks like, but it's still a right. And one of the things that the court said in Planned Parenthood in Roe versus Wade is that a fetus is not a person for purposes of 14th Amendment protection. So even though there are still moral questions that people raise, and almost certainly rightly so, about fetal personhood, that's not what our constitutional order says. And then finally, cases like Meyer versus Nebraska or Prince versus Massachusetts and Pierce versus Society of Sisters, which were all cases that basically said that we have a right to make decisions as parents for our minor children. But of course, that right is not unfettered, as is true of all of our constitutional rights. So the through line here is that the core elements of RJ, or reproductive justice, are represented by the law. But of course, the question is, what does any of that mean in practice? So I gave you the background on RJ and an intro to the law, and that's what I just did is pretty foundational to my work. And everything that I offered up to you is basically what I would talk about in any typical talk. And it was a very normal sort of opening, but I want to acknowledge that I'm giving this talk in 2020, which, as we all know, is anything but a normal year, and normalcy has been quite hard to come by. And we've leaned into the ways in which this year is not normal. And for months now, we've heard the words unprecedented, uncertain, extraordinary, and unpredictable repeated over and over. Yet so much about our current COVID-19 world is stunningly ordinary, predictable, and normal, starting with the constant reminders of the precarious state of Black and brown bodies in the United States. So America, even in a pandemic, is the same as it ever was. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So again, just to remind you, reproductive justice says that every mother, every parent really, deserves to be able to raise her children in safe and healthy environments, make decisions about becoming pregnant and making decisions about terminating pregnancy. But here's what we know about this country. We know that as compared to white people, Black people in the United States have lower rates of having health insurance, have worse health outcomes across a range of diseases, are more likely to die in childbirth or soon after, are more likely to be medically infertile, have higher rates of childhood asthma, are incarcerated at a higher rate, live in neighborhoods with higher levels of environmental hazards, are significantly more likely to die in their first year of life, are more likely to be low income and live in neighborhoods that are over-policed, and are killed by police at a disproportionate rate. So knowing all of this, it's not surprising that what we've seen in the COVID era is this wildly disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and brown communities, marked by painfully high numbers of infections. So if you can't read the top of this slide, it is a chart of 16 states where the Black resident share of the population is higher than the national percentage. And it shows that the prevalence of death of Black people in these states exceeded their population share by as much as 25 percentage points in some places. Further data from the Kaiser Family Foundation shows the rate of hospitalizations and death among active EPIC patients in July 2020. And again, we see the disproportionate number of Black and brown folks who are included in those numbers. And the impacts, of course, go beyond the physical, and they are economic and psychological as well. So of course, we've seen people who have suffered extreme financial hardship, women who are reporting significant mental health concerns as a consequence of COVID-19, and both Black and Latino residents reporting pandemic-related mental health concerns at a rate approximately 10 points higher than their white counterparts. Now, none of this data should be surprising, given that even in the best of times, and I'm not even sure what counts as the best of times, disparities of this kind are rampant. Now, also during the pandemic, we've seen attempts in multiple states to cut off abortion access by declaring abortion services to be non-essential and denying access to telehealth for medical abortions. And we well know that making it harder to get an abortion is an attack on Black women in particular, who disproportionately have abortions in this country. These are the women who bear the brunt when forced to carry pregnancies to term that they otherwise would have terminated. And when we hear politicians like Ted Cruz, who several weeks ago claimed that pregnancy is not a life-threatening condition, it's shocking to hear that in a country that has the highest maternal mortality rate among all developed nations, and where Black women are 2.5 times more likely to die from their pregnancies than are white women. We've watched as poor women who are already on the brink of economic disaster were forced to continue low-wage work because suddenly they were essential. Women who were earning minimum wage, who had to brave public transportation, employers with inadequate PPE, belligerent customers even, in order to bring home paltry paychecks. Children whose access to food, dental care, and mental health services collapsed when public schools closed, because that is the venue through which these children received a wide collection of those services. Blatant voter suppression, blatant and unapologetic voter suppression. This is actually a picture from the summer, but I could have used pictures from just last week as we watched the lines for early voting, where we actually saw some people stand in line for 12, 11 hours in order to be able to vote because of the closure of polling places in poor communities and communities of color. And through it all, Black mothers are still bearing their children too soon in a country where maternal and infant mortality rates for Black women, as I said before, outstrip those of white women. And a world in which Black people continue to be killed by police officers on streets, in their bedrooms, and in their cars, with no justice to be found. This season has reminded all of us that the Black mothers in this country often have not been able to protect their children from violence in their neighborhoods, or from their schools that they attend, or police brutality, or preventable illnesses, or medical neglect, or so many other things that parents want to protect their children from. There is a long line of Black mothers who mourn children who are gone too soon. Women like Mamie Till Mobley, who is the mother of Emmett Till, Gwen Carr, who's the mother of Eric Garner, Leslie McSpaden, the mother of Michael Brown, and Sabrina Fulton, the mother of Trayvon Martin. And then a few weeks ago, we heard about the whistleblower complaint from Don Wooten about sterilization abuse on women detained in a privately run ICE facility in Georgia. And only in a year like 2020 would we see that story fall off the radar screen almost immediately. And of course, I'm not surprised that the nurse who blew the whistle on this horrific sterilization abuse in that ICE facility is a Black woman, because Black women and other women of color well know the history of sterilization abuse in this country. So I've given you lots of sad things, and unfortunately, I'm not going to give you any happy things before I finish speaking. So all the things that I have talked about and all the things that we've seen so far are as American as apple pie. All of it is so ordinary, so run of the mill, that sometimes it's hard to believe that we are actually capable of being better or doing better than this. In other words, what we're seeing now isn't a glitch in the system, it's a feature. And I'll tell you how I know it's a feature, and I'm going to use two stories to tell you about it. So the first is the story of Buck versus Bell, a case which, of course, I know Alicia is very aware of because of her work. So for those of you who don't know, Carrie Buck was a young woman who lived in Virginia. She basically lived as a sort of foster child, kind of domestic servant for a family. She became pregnant as a result of being raped by someone who was a relative of the family that she was living with. And so at the age of 18, she became a mother. And then she was institutionalized in the Virginia Home for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded. And I should say this was in the 1920s, so I'm using the language from then. She was institutionalized as an unwed mother. Turns out that Carrie's mother was also institutionalized there, in part because of her promiscuity and her history of having a child also without being married. And those things purportedly marked her as feeble-minded. Now, Carrie was also labeled as being somebody who had a developmental disability, though the historical record indicates that she was not actually developmentally disabled or didn't have any mental health issues in any way. So all of this is happening during a very long and shameful period of forced eugenic sterilizations in America. And Carrie was targeted for that sterilization under Virginia's law that allowed sterilizations for people who were considered to be feeble-minded. So Carrie's case eventually wound its way to the US Supreme Court, where the court declared that forced sterilization laws could stand, in a case, by the way, that has yet to be overturned by the Supreme Court. And in his opinion, Justice Holmes famously wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough," referring there to Carrie, to her mother, and to her infant daughter, Vivian. So that's one way that we can see how this kind of regulation of access to being a parent and to becoming pregnant and to taking care of your babies is very much a part of our American history and our American present. Now, let me tell you another story. So this story is a story about the Ralph sisters. And the Ralph sisters were 2 Black sisters who were living with their parents in public housing in Montgomery, Alabama in 1973. They also had an older sister named Katie, and I'm gonna leave her out of the story for now. But Mary Alice and Minnie, who were the 2 youngest girls in their family, were both developmentally disabled. And their family was very poor, and they received services from the Family Planning Clinic of the Montgomery Community Action Committee, which, after you went through a whole bunch of layers, was a committee that was funded by the Federal Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which ultimately became the Department of Health and Human Services. So it's federal funding that was used to provide these services to this family, to this Black family, and to dozens and dozens of other Black families. So for a period of many years, representatives from the CAC were deeply involved in the health care that the Ralph sisters were getting. They started giving them birth control without their consent. First in 1971, they started giving experimental birth control injections to Katie, the oldest sister. And then not too long after that, the youngest girls also began receiving those shots. Later on, they gave Katie an IUD without telling her parents and without having a conversation with her as well. Then in June 1973, a nurse arrived at the Ralph home to pick up Mrs. Ralph and her 2 youngest daughters, so Mary Alice and Minnie, who at the time were 14 and 12. They eventually ended up at a local hospital. The nurse asked Mrs. Ralph to sign a consent form, though Mrs. Ralph could neither read nor write. So believing that she was consenting to birth control shots, Mrs. Ralph signed an X on the consent form, seemingly agreeing to treatment for her minor children. She was told to leave the girls at the hospital, which she did. No one told the girls why they were in the hospital or what plans were being made for them. The next morning, doctors administered general anesthesia to Minnie and Mary Alice and surgically sterilized both girls, despite the lack of informed consent from their parents or even assent from the girls themselves. And the picture that I'm showing you is actually a picture of them showing their scars from that surgery. This kind of abusive use of sterilization against two poor Black girls was part of a pattern of sterilizations conducted in public hospitals or by healthcare providers who were otherwise receiving federal financial assistance. Fannie Lou Hamer, the famous civil rights activist, referred to these involuntary sterilizations as Mississippi appendectomies. And she did that because it was so rampant for Black women, poor Black women, to go into the hospital for some sort of medical care and find out later that while there, they had been sterilized without their knowledge or consent. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which still exists, eventually filed suit against the federal government on behalf of the Ralph sisters and other women and girls who'd been subjected to these abusive sterilization practices. And the lawsuit ended up settling when the agency agreed to an official change in practice and new regulations that made clear that sterilization was a procedure that could be provided to those competent to consent and only after an informed consent process. The creation of those procedural safeguards was critical, but sadly it remains the case that sterilization practices, especially when it comes to poor women or women of color, are not always neutral. Now, I wanted to share the Ralph story in some detail because it's vital in this space to take note of the ways in which reproductive oppression and reproductive hierarchies have intersectional implications. For the Ralph sisters, it was the combination of being Black, female, poor, and developmentally disabled that led to their unconsented sterilization. It was all of those things coming together that meant that our government was not willing to protect them. So I would love to leave you today with some words that are uplifting and hopeful, but what I really want is to leave you with an urgent sense of the need to act. We are living through extraordinary times that tragically highlight how ordinary oppression is in this country. We're challenged to stand against ignorance, discrimination, and oppression because reproductive justice demands that we recognize, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, that our freedom depends on removing the shackles from others, even if they are different from our own. I'm exhausted, as I'm sure lots of you are in this year, but I'm also angry, and I believe really deeply in the power of righteous anger. We can't be paralyzed by the enormity of the work that lies before us to protect the most vulnerable among us. As Audre Lorde also said, our silence will not protect us. So even if we are masked, which we all should be because that's good public health, our voices still work. So be loud, be angry, make demands, recognize that being an ally often means using your privilege to amplify the voices of the marginalized, and vote as if your life depended on it, because this year, it actually just might. So thanks so much to all of you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much. That was just phenomenal. And just so important to remind ourselves of in these tough times. We do have questions from the audience, but I know that our dean wanted to ask a couple questions directly. Dean, do you want to go ahead and do that, or should you want to go ahead and do that?
Sure. First, I just want to thank Dean Mutcherson for being here. Kim, it's great to see you. And when you put the quote up about saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," I thought of you in particular this year as such an incredible leader for all of us, the deans, and facing all the challenges that we faced. Kim has been instrumental in doing anti-racist work and helping the deans to figure out what we can do, and the fact that you were able to write this lecture and deliver it while doing everything else you do, which it seems to include having the world's loudest ice cream truck parked out your window, is you are a hero. You're amazing, and thank you so much for being here. The work that you do is so important. So I didn't come with planned questions. I wanted to respond or to think about some of the things that you said, and one of the things that you said that I wanted to dig in, we've got a lot of law students on the line. In the beginning of your talk, as you were explaining reproductive justice, you said the focus, that when we focus on white women's issues, that it marginalizes Black women and Black people and other oppressed people. And I'm wondering if you can just give some concrete examples of that to help us better understand, what does that mean? What, you know, we're trying to do the right thing and we're focusing on the white women. So what does that mean?
Sure. So I'll give you an example that I think is sort of the most concrete and one that will hopefully be illuminating for people. So one of the reasons why reproductive justice was created was that so much of the reproductive rights movement was focused on abortion, right? And it was focused that way because it was a movement, and still, frankly, is a movement largely led by middle-class white women who wanted to be able to control their decision-making about pregnancy and about whether they were going to carry a pregnancy to term, which is totally fair. And so, you know, the fight basically was, well, we need abortion to be legal, because once abortion is legal, then that's great and women can have access to abortion services. But here's what we know. So one, even when abortion was illegal, lots of white women and women who had money were still able to get abortions, right? Because they were able to travel, they were able to, you know, go on a vacation and terminate a pregnancy by virtue of that. So they were already in a privileged state. And so creating a world in which abortion in the United States was legal worked really well for that group of women. What it didn't do, though, was create space for poor women, for Black women in the world that we live in now, for women who are immigrants to this country, who even in a world where abortion is legal, still don't have access. And they don't have access for a range of reasons. They don't have access because of the Hyde Amendment, which says that Medicaid won't pay for you to have an abortion, except in cases of rape and incest, depending upon what state you're in. They don't have access because the rules that are put in place in order to access abortion services make it more difficult for them to access those services. So for instance, if you have you know, a 24 or 48 hour waiting period, which means that you have to be able to come back to the clinic more than once, well, it's harder to do that. One, if you have kids at home that nobody else is going to take care of for you. And most people who have abortions in this country are already mothers. Or two, if you have a job that says you don't show up tomorrow, you lose your job, right? I mean, one of the things that's been really striking to me about, you know, life in a pandemic is, frankly, how easy in some ways it was for me to start living a life from my house, right? It's my house. I get to decide what happens in it. I've got access to great internet. You know, I've got space, right? All of these sorts of things, and nobody's going to fire me because I'm not in my office right now. So there are all of these ways in which, when you are focusing on women who are starting out with privilege, that you're going to leave lots of other women behind. Whereas if we were thinking about those women who didn't have abortion access, well, we would make abortion legal, yeah, but we'd also provide opportunities for women to be able to get state assistance to terminate pregnancies. We would think really carefully about what the rules are in order to be able to access, right? All of those things are a little bit different when your starting point is much further from the starting line than is true for other people.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's so important. So we've just witnessed this, you mentioned the Supreme Court confirmation hearings and lots of focus, right, on abortion. Mm-hmm. I don't quite know how to ask this question. A lot of it is this sort of focus from this traditional lens of the feminist approach to reproductive rights, right? What would it look like if the questions had come from a reproductive justice?
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the things, this has been a rough year. So, you know, one of the things that I think was, that I wish I had seen more, right, in those conversations, is a recognition that even questions of, you know, access to abortion implicate far more wide-ranging issues, right? So they implicate things like, what kind of access to healthcare did you have in the first place? So if we get rid of the ACA, how many people are going to end up without access to healthcare who otherwise would have had it? If we get rid of protections for people who are here in this country, who perhaps weren't born here, but have basically lived their entire lives in this country, then we are creating space where they don't have access to the things that are available to them because they are here. If we are continuing to erode the Voting Rights Act, then that slice of power that all of us should have by virtue of being able to vote, we lose access to that as well. So I think that the way to sort of, and look, Supreme Court confirmations hearings have become their own, you know, theatrical farce. So, you know, I don't want to pretend like, you know, that we're going to go back to the days where it actually means something. But I think that the challenge is there, and the challenge is frankly, to, you know, anybody who comes to the court with a belief that we can interpret the Constitution based on the text and based on what our founders intended is a real failure of imagination in a whole host of different ways. So, you know, I just think that we, you know, really need to be asking questions about, you know, what kind of country do we want to be? You know, do we want to be a place where there is empathy? Do we want to be a place where there's kindness? Or do we want to be a place where if you know, we can decide that it doesn't matter that you don't have, you know, boots, we want you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
I was struck by in your comments about choice and this sort of conservative, you know, everyone needs to make responsible choices, right? But the choices aren't available, and yet choices that the language we use around the abortion debate. So it's sort of an interesting juxtaposition, and what you just said reminded me that. I was also really struck when you talk about the sterilization of women in ICE facilities, and it is shocking, right? It is beyond the pale. It is an unbelievable atrocity, and yet it didn't even last one instant.
Yeah.
Right. And so you sort of ended with the call to arms. How do we pay attention, and how do we make a difference when there is so much coming at us that it's like running, you know, through an avalanche of this bad stuff?
Yeah, I mean, you know, first of all, I'll say that, you know, anybody who, you know, needs to take a break in this year, you should take a break because this year has asked too much of every single one of us. But, you know, I think one of the most important things is to be able to acknowledge the ways in which you are privileged. So one of the things that I say to students at my law school, and I think it's completely true, is no matter where you came from, once you earn a law degree, you're privileged, right? You may not be as privileged as some people are, but you're definitely privileged. And I recognize the whole host of ways in which I am privileged by virtue of the education I had, you know, the job that I have, all of those sorts of things. And feeling, what's the word I'm looking for? When you get defensive about privilege, then it's really hard to have conversations about how we become a more equitable society, right? I don't have what I have because I am so much smarter than everybody else in the world, right? So much of my ability to be successful is that I was born to people for whom education was incredibly important in lots of ways because of what they saw in their own family. And so they thought it was really critical that my sister and I get the best education that they could give to us, and that they supported us in that. So, you know, I don't buy into the sort of myth that if we are successful, it is because we have raised ourselves up. And we know that about this country, right? The most important thing that you can do in order to be rich in this country is to be born to rich people, right? So I think one of the first things is that people just have to acknowledge that there are lots of ways in which they walk through the world with privilege, and then be willing to imagine what it would be like to share some of that or to shed some of that, and acknowledge that. Because if we can't do that, then we don't get anywhere, right? And that requires people having some, being very self-reflective. It requires people being willing to be challenged. And as you said, one of the things that I have been doing over these last, few months is really working on a lot of anti-racism work related to law schools. And, even some of my colleagues who I think would describe themselves as very left and very progressive are getting pretty defensive about some of these conversations. So, I think it's, it really behooves people, as I said before, to decide what kind of country you want to live in. And if that country is a place that actually lives up, right? If we want to talk about, text that actually lives up to the words of our Constitution, then that's going to require people to share a lot more than they are already.
All right, I wanted to take some of the questions from the chat now. Are we able to go to people? Professor Clark, can you unmute yourself? Is he allowed? Can you ask your question?
If I can remember it.
I can
in the chat.
Yes, I can. It was about the assurances that we have received during the Barrett confirmation process, and the assurances, I put quotation marks around because they don't even go to the full reproductive justice concerns. But the assurance is that if Roe is overruled, don't worry, abortion will remain legally available in a number of places. So almost no big deal from this assurance perspective. But as you mentioned, one of the holdings of Roe was that a fetus is not a person under the 14th Amendment. So I was wondering your thoughts on, and again, I apologize, this doesn't get into the broader reproductive justice ideas that you're really talking about, but what are your thoughts on the prospects of that part of Roe itself being overruled, so that we now find that fetuses and embryos and fertilized eggs are all persons, and what's the effect of that on the availability of abortion and in those and these assurances that we've been getting?
Yeah. So I'll say two things about that. So the first one is, people who are saying, don't worry, abortion will still be legal. Abortion is legal now and inaccessible to hundreds of women in this country. So that doesn't feel like a huge assurance to me about much of anything. And what we would find ourselves in is a situation where, what was true before Roe, which was if you have the resources, you're always going to be able to terminate. If you don't have the resources, you won't be able to, right? So it's great to say, oh, you can just cross it. You can just cross over. So for instance, I live in New Jersey, right? Women in New Jersey are going to continue to have access to abortion services, but you know who isn't? Women who live in Pennsylvania, right? And so like the idea that you can just hop over a border it just isn't going to be true for so many people. The thing that's really different though, is that we now live in a world of medication abortion. And so what we're seeing now are state legislators and Congress eventually will get around to it too, trying to make it harder for women to access medication abortions, right? So, the idea that we live in a world in which you could buy pills on the internet and terminate your first trimester pregnancy, makes it harder to shut things down. So those are the telehealth bans, requiring somebody getting a medication abortion to come into a facility and do the informed consent process and then come back again the next day to get the pills, like things that just don't make sense at all. So that's the first thing. We already don't have accessible abortion. So, the illegality thing is only a part of it. And then the second thing, so one of the things that's been really interesting. So my work is abortion and assisted reproduction. And one of the things that I have been talking about for a long time is how unfortunate it is that people who provide fertility services, you are reproductive endocrinologists, assisted reproduction folks, are very careful to separate themselves from people who perform abortions. And yet there are a whole host of ways in which those two ways of practicing medicine are quite similar. And I'll just give you one example. Let's say you are using fertility services and you get pregnant with 6 embryos, 6 fetuses, and your reproductive endocrinologist says to you, it's dangerous, right? You're probably not gonna be able to carry all 6 of them. You might lose them all. You might use some of them. So what we can do is we can do a procedure called a selective reduction. They never call it an abortion. We can do a selective reduction and we can make sure that you're pregnant with 2 instead of 4, right? But we don't talk about those as abortions, and we don't talk about, a 48-hour waiting period and all these other sorts of things that have to happen in the context of abortion services. So the space where you have seen these two worlds come together is personhood amendments. So lots of the states that have tried to get personhood amendments on the ballot, or have gotten them on the ballot and tried to get them passed, have lost, in no small measure because that's a point where the fertility people come out in force and say, if you want to lose IVF, go ahead, pass this personhood amendment, right? So I think that there are, and when we think about assisted reproduction, that's the other thing that I should say, when we think about assisted reproduction, we tend to think about wealthier white people who can afford to pay, $15,000 a cycle to try to get pregnant using IVF. And so there's much more power in that community. And so I think it's harder oftentimes to push the personhood agenda too far because there are actually people with power who reject it. So, somebody who says, I would never have an abortion, but I'm going to freeze, 30 embryos and only use 5 of them. So I think we are less likely to find ourselves in a place where the court ever decides that a fetus is a person. But even without doing that, we have criminal laws throughout the states that will punish people for acts that end up causing, harm to a fetus or terminating a pregnancy. So we're already doing the work, even without having that language from the court.
Do you think the connection between those two issues is why it was surprising to me to hear Barrett not willing to address IVF and things like that for the reasons you talk about, people with power. Is this personhood thing, is that what you think is behind her unwillingness to be more supportive of the IVF issues?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's there are a number of communities, whether it's cultural or religious, who find assisted reproduction to be incredibly problematic for a host of different reasons. And so I think it is, it is less popular in some ways to go after IVF and assisted reproduction than it is to go after abortion. In part because the ultimate goal of assisted reproduction is to produce babies. And if that's what you think, everybody should be producing babies, then you can only get so angry about that kind of work. And yet, so much of what happens in terms of, the manipulation of embryos, the creation of embryos, the destruction of embryos, so much of what happens there is much more similar to abortion than lots of people will talk about.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when there was a hurricane and there was a fertility clinic in Louisiana, and there was a personhood amendment in place, or an act at that point. And the question was, do you have to save the freezer of frozen embryos first? Because that was hundreds of human persons according to the law.
Yeah, exactly.
So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out when we have a new Supreme Court justice. We have a couple of folks in the audience who are alums, and they are asking the question, and Olivia Orlando, thank you for this question. How do you suggest that young, passionate attorneys get into reproductive advocacy policy work without having on-point prior experience?
So is this a question from somebody who's a current law student or somebody who's already out there in the world?
She's out there in the world. She's been working. Olivia, when did you graduate? Maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I think she's down in one of the DA's offices.
Got it. So I think there are a few ways. So one, there is used to be called Law Students for Reproductive Justice. It's now called If, When, How, which obviously is focused initially on law students, but they also do some really interesting work just sort of out in the world with lawyers and with future lawyers about reproductive justice issues. So that's one way to sort of get involved with it. Another way is, and it sort of depends on whether you're looking at like a total career change or if you're just looking at being able to do, some good things here and there. But another way to do this work is fellowship opportunities that are available at some of these more of the reproductive rights organizations and the reproductive justice organizations. But even there, we're seeing some interesting organizations come up like the Lawyering Project, which just started a few years ago, which was started by people who came from the Center for Reproductive Rights. And part of the reason why they started a new organization was because they want to be able to do more affirmative work instead of always being on the defensive. So you have organizations like the Lawyering Project that are doing interesting work. And then I think the other piece of it is figuring out ways that you can do, pro bono work. So even if it's something like, representing a young woman in a judicial bypass hearing, there are those sorts of opportunities that can come up where you can really be of assistance to somebody who otherwise might not be able to exercise various choices.
Thank you. Some good advice. It's always a challenge to get in, but it's so important to have people fighting the good fight. So there's a question here from the chat. How can we reconcile the need to promote reproductive justice when the very rights of healthcare are in peril? So that existential threats to healthcare, period. Should we be focusing on reproductive justice?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is great about reproductive justice is that it is so broad, right? And that it is really thinking very deeply about, again, what's the society that we want to live in? What's the society that we want to create? I was having a conversation with some folks earlier today who are doing some human rights work about infertility. And the conversation that we were having was, different ways to think about infertility that are not just about access to treatment, but about, I don't know if it's further upstream or downstream, like things before you get a diagnosis of being a person who's infertile, right? So, the fact that we have women working in places where, in factories that aren't safe for anybody, right? Let alone for somebody who wants to become pregnant, that women are, doing work in places where they're not being given the accommodations that they need in order to be able to be pregnant and continue to work, right? That's why we had the UPS case a few years ago. That we have a healthcare system where so Black women are overrepresented in the number of people who are medically infertile in this country. And one of the reasons for that is untreated STIs, right? One of the most basic things that people could get access to as a way to avoid infertility, and they don't have access to it. So, using reproductive justice as a sort of centerpiece way to talk about all these other issues that are inherent and thinking about how people make decisions about whether they want to become parents, how they want to parent once they do become parents, and whether they want to terminate a pregnancy for a range of different reasons. So one of the things that I like about reproductive justice is that it is a way to talk about all of these other things. And it's also, the other thing that's really interesting in this space, and I was talking to these folks this morning about this as well, is that it really forces people to recognize some of their own prejudices and flaws when you talk about people having babies and becoming parents. right? So I teach a class at my law school called Bioethics, Babies, and Baby Making, which is super, super fun to teach. And we talk about abortion and assisted reproduction and like all these other sorts of things. And it's really interesting to watch these students, some of whom describe themselves as being sort of very left, very pro-choice, very progressive. And then we start talking about things like, should someone with an intellectual disability be able to have a baby, or should someone with, a developmental disability, should their parents be able to decide that they should be, sterilized? And you can sort of watch people have this moment of being like, well, I think I know what I'm supposed to say, but I don't want to say it, right? And so there's this way in which we feel like we should have some sort of control over this part of people's lives in a way that we don't necessarily think about other parts of people's lives. So it's really quite striking. And I know, again, sort of going back to Alicia, and, one of the places where I think, we can have some of the best conversations here is in talking about disability and pregnancy and parenting, because it really requires us, a lot of us, I think, to look inward and recognize some of the deep prejudices that we have, and the ways in which we think that parenting should be, a solo practice, right? Like the amount of love I would have if I could have a family with like 6 different parents, would be absolutely amazing. And yet we don't sort of think about the world in that way, right? We sort of think about it in this very narrow way, and really sort of the most difficult way you could think about people having babies and raising them. So, there are a lot of lessons that we need to learn that we haven't learned yet.
Professor Lynch, are you able to ask your question? Come in, otherwise I'll read it.
Thank you. This was wonderful. I have so many questions. One that I put in the chat, and I'm thinking about a couple of things. One is this, reproductive sabotage, which often we talk about, birth control sabotage, reproductive forcing, and there's some students here in our domestic violence seminar that have read about this and thought about this and written papers about this. But I think what really touched me, a phrase you used early on in your talk, was the painful limitations of white women allyship. And I think that, I see in my classes and in my students this on all issues, whether it's racial justice, LGBTQ, et cetera, this really attempt that they want to be good allies, and they want to be better allies than those of us who came before them.
Right.
And I think that we as professors have learned from some of that about allyship. And so I guess I have 2 parts to that question. One is, do you have recommendations for thoughtful allyship in this area? And then 2, the sort of the flip side of that is, I think that what is really hard in the digital age, I mean, it's always been hard to see that reproductive justice is only about abortion. That has just played into the hands of politicians and those who want to hurt women for a long time, as sort of taking this one issue and then recharacterizing what it is. And you even described how we shouldn't, they're calling different things. And so I think that the flip side is some of our sense of what's wrong with the shoulders that we're standing on a little bit, because part of it is there was imperfection, right? And pain. But there also are shoulders we're standing on that had to use the political sort of interstices of the day. And so how do we both be better allies, but also be aware with each other that when you take theory and you implement it into practice, sometimes the places you can do it are not as comprehensive as one might like.
Absolutely. So let me answer the, sort of the first part, which is, how can people engage in thoughtful allyship? And, from my perspective, the most important part of thoughtful allyship is knowing when to shut up, right? Because I think one of the things that is really striking to me often in conversations is people who sort of want to, because if you want to be empathetic, you want to feel like, okay, I get it too, right? But you don't always get it. You haven't always been there. It isn't necessarily your experience. And so being able to listen to other people and to recognize the validity of how they move through the world and what their experiences are as they move through the world, I think is really critical. And then the second thing I think is what I said before, which is being able to recognize and own your own privilege. There's no value. I don't think, there's any value in pretending like all women are positioned in the same way. It's just not true. Right. And even the conversation that we're having this year about, the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and all of my Black women friends were saying, we didn't get to vote, right? Good for you, but we didn't get to vote. Right. So I think, really being conscious of the ways in which white women have often benefited from carrying water for white supremacy and for patriarchy. And you kind of get it, right? I mean, people want to get power where they can get power, but it's hard to be an ally when you are, taking that power that is made available to you in that way. And then the second part of it is, and I think that this is always a challenge in any sort of attempt to change the world that we live in, right? Which is, and this is a frustration that my students feel all the time when they want things to be different at the law school. And I'm like, I literally have no control over the faculty. They do whatever they want to. But people want there to be some magic wand that you can wave, and then the world is a different place. And the truth of the matter is, and you can just look at the transition from Obama to Trump and see how easy it is to, go 3 steps forward and it feels like 4 steps back. So it's a constant vigilance, and it is deciding that the world that you live in is not the world that you want your children to live in, or anybody who you care about who's going to be a part of the future. And so I think that that's sort of the way that we always have to be kind of positioning ourselves, that, I don't assume that whatever better world is coming is a world that I am necessarily going to live in. But I would like to think that I am helping to continue to lay the foundation for, what that's going to look like. And that, of course, assumes that we don't all go the way of the dinosaurs, right? Which might also be what happens. But assuming we're all still around, my hope
probably
is
not
that,
next year, though.
Probably not next year, exactly. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think we have to be willing to accept small victories.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to accept that sometimes we're going to have to win those victories over and over and over again.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. There's a lot going on in the chat, so I may be missing things. Professor Brieger.
I believe Professor Maurer had a question, and it's a little bit buried up there. Let me see. Have you seen an RJ issue with denial of access to sterilization procedures as part of access to health care generally?
So I'm actually glad you asked this question, because I was going to answer one of the other, I think it was one of the questions you asked me earlier, Alicia, where I was talking about sort of abortion access and how, if you were privileged, you always had access, and if you weren't. So, one of the other issues that was a sort of cornerstone of the initial sort of discussions about reproductive justice was about access to sterilization, particularly for young women. And what was happening was you had these sort of younger white women who said, I don't want to have kids. And they would go into their, gynecologist, almost always male, and say, listen, I want to get my tubes tied. And the doctor would say, you're totally going to change your mind. I'm never going to do this procedure on like a 25-year-old unmarried woman. Totally unacceptable. Right. And so you had, on one hand, you had white women who were complaining about being treated and sort of infantilized that way by their healthcare providers. And then the other side of it, you had Black women who were saying, we're getting sterilized without our consent. Right? It's not about us going to the doctor's office and saying, I don't want to have babies. It's the doctor deciding I'm not a person who should be able to have access to parenting and have access to procreation. And so, that's one of those sort of interesting spaces where you can see how different women are positioned, right? One, having access to healthcare such that you could walk into a doctor's office and say, hey, this is what I want to have happen. The other side of the coin of that, I'll say, is, you'll hear some people who are doing this kind of work who will talk about poor women who are on LARC, long acting reversible contraception, and who go back to their providers and say, I'm ready to be done with this, take it out. And the provider says, not yet, let's wait on that. Right. Which is such a shock, it's such a shocking thing to imagine. And yet those are the kinds of stories that women are telling. So, there's a lot of stuff out there. And again, I think this is why it's so important to be a person who listens, because the things that you learn about are really critical. So, another example, I was at a conference for people who do family planning, and so they do abortion services and contraception and all these other sorts of things. And one of the conversations was about pain management for abortion for women who are opioid users or who are in recovery, right? So there are like all these things, like I never would have even thought about that, right? How do you keep somebody from relapsing? Or what if it's actually better for them to still be getting high, right? So, those are the kinds of things that I think we want to be able to listen to those stories and to accept the truth of those stories, and to think about how different those women's lives are than our own in lots of cases, and how do we help them be people who are able to live with dignity and who get the respect that they deserve in the world.
There's so much arrogance out there.
Oh.
Decision making for other people.
It's amazing.
My work around people with disabilities,
right?
It's just. Are you up for one more question?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Professor Chung, so she's thinking about RJ work given the court packing of the Trump presidency.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment on strategies to advance RJ given the likely hostility in the federal court system?
Yeah, I mean, it's been like on one level, you have to admire the number of federal judges who have been confirmed over the last 4 years. I mean, it's sort of amazing. And it's, it's a real testament to what it looks like when you are, so focused on the prize, which is what Republicans, frankly, have been really good at for quite some time. So, I think that part of what is going to be, what's going to have to happen, well, two things really. So one is, and I say this as somebody who has been teaching at Rutgers Law School for 18 years with a person who is the foremost expert on state constitutional law kind of in the world. And, what Bob Williams would say is this is a time when you start turning to state constitutions, many of which, or at least some of which, are much broader than the federal constitution, provides in some cases specific privacy rights. And so it may be the case that the federal courts, because they will end up being so unfriendly, are not the place where you want to litigate some of these cases. And then the second thing I'll say, and this sort of goes back to what I was saying before about, the Lawyering Project and people creating these projects that are looking to be affirmative as opposed to constantly being on the defensive. And, part of what they're doing is also thinking about legislation, thinking about constitutional amendments. So ways that we can create, affirmative law that talks about, somebody's right to contraception, or somebody's right to terminate a pregnancy, or, somebody's right to fertility services, so that those things don't become this kind of amorphous privacy right, but they become something that is, specifically articulated. Now, you have to have the right state for that. You have to have the right state legislature for that. I mean, there's a lot of work that's involved with that. But if you can't, if we're going to end up with terrible remedies from the federal courts, and sometimes they surprise you, right? Like, who saw Bostock coming? I mean, some people saw Bostock coming, but that was quite an outcome. Bostock, for folks who don't know, is the case that was decided fairly recently, in which the court decided that transgender folks were protected under federal civil rights law because discrimination against them was discrimination on the basis of sex. And Gorsuch, what, right? Who knew? So sometimes they will surprise us, but it definitely seems like we need to be thinking in different ways about how to secure rights for people, particularly depending on, what happens on November 3rd.
Can I just add one thing and follow up to that, Dina? And thank you. I sort of wonder, as a lawyer, I think I fall into the trap of thinking that I've got this hammer, so everything's a nail, right? And I'm thinking that in addition to some of the state court or state legislative strategies that you've outlined, just sort of rethinking advocacy generally, like what does the whole toolbox look like? Because sort of getting the legislator to do the right thing is the culmination of a long process that precedes the legislator voting or proposing, being the sponsor of a bill, right? So just sort of how to sort of take the energy, because litigation may not be the right strategy right now, and rethinking our full toolkit of advocacy tools might be something useful, given what it's going to look like in the federal court system for God knows how long.
Yeah. So I remember being at a conference once. This was years ago, and Billie Avery was there, who's a Black woman who was a very longstanding women's health advocate, and had done really amazing work. And she was giving this talk, and she was talking about lack of access to abortion services in the communities that she was working with, and particularly in poor Black women's communities. And she said, so, we just opened a clinic. And it was like the most casual thing to say. And yet, it was an incredibly profound act of activism, to engage in that and say women don't have access to this thing. And so let's build a place where they have access to this thing. So I feel like there's also this amount of, and I feel like I'm sort of like a little too old and conservative to be a good participant in this, but, I see some of the grassroots activism that is going on in this country, and I'm wowed by it. And people who say, we're not going to get what we want from a system, I'm channeling them and saying this. So this is not me necessarily saying this, or maybe it is, who knows, but I'm channeling them. People say, we have this fundamentally corrupt system. We're never going to get what we want out of it. We really have to think about sort of engaging in various kinds of self-help. And I really admire that. And I do think that, that's another thing that we see in this kind of younger generation of folks. And I think it's incredibly admirable. And I think that a lot of them are going to do amazing things in the years to come. And they're not going to go to court to do it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great way to sort of end. It's a positive note. And I have to say, even though a lot of what you talked about is devastating, I come away from this conversation, reading the chat, the questions, your answers, your energy, and I feel energized. And I just want to thank you. I know that if we were in our big room, we would all be on our feet giving a standing ovation. So can I ask the host to turn off? Let us clap out loud over Zoom as loudly as we can.
Bravo! Bravo! Bravo!
Really,
Well, thank you so much.
it was really wonderful. And first of all, I hope you and your family, your kids are great. And I wish I could give you a big hug right now on behalf of the Albany Law family. Thank you for being here, and wish we could go and take you for a fancy dinner, but we can't. So we owe you one. I know we are all really grateful for your time and your thoughts and your brilliance. And hang in there. And
yeah, all of us.
all of us.
Well, thank you so much. This was a huge pleasure. Thank you all for being here and being so engaged. And this was really fun. So I appreciate it.
All right. So now we do the awkward thing where we sign off Zoom and we're back in our bedrooms.
Yeah.
But thank you.
We are going to save you the chat because the chat is just overflowing with love for you.
Oh,
so we're going to
awesome.
save that chat for you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Of course. Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Stay safe.
You too.